Hi, everyone, and welcome to this discussion about some of the postmodern poems that you've read for this unit. This lesson is going to cover Theodore Roethke's My Papa's Waltz, Robert Hayden's Those Winter Sundays, and Lee Young Lee's Eating Alone and Eating Together. These poems focus specifically on children and parents. In some instances, we have a poem that is a speaker who is a child speaking to a parent, and then in some instances, the poem depicts a child who is describing a parent or speaking about a parent. Here are some of the things I'd like for us to notice. We're going to look at form. I want you to notice how each poem offers a single unique perspective from one person. We've got lots of up close and detailed observation. There's very interesting play going on with time in many of these poems, so kind of a mashup of the past, the present, and the future. There's an emphasis on memory, which is also something that we talked about with some of the short fiction that we've read. Many juxtapositions, life and death, decay and growth, hope and despair, sorrow and contentment, isolation and connection. And in each poem, hopefully you'll be able to recognize that there seems to be this underlying question about the truth, about what the truth actually is regarding a certain person or an event, and then a question about whether or not it's actually possible to get at what the truth. So let's get started. The first poem I'm going to talk about is My Papa's Waltz by Theodore Roethke. This is probably a poem that you have read in the past, maybe in your English 1020 class or possibly in high school. It's got a very standard form, which makes sense. The title has waltz in it, and this poem has a very clear rhythm to it, a steady rhythm. Hopefully you listened to the recording of Theodore Roethke reading this poem. There are 4 stanzas, and the rhyme scheme is also very standard, A, B, A, B. So on the first line, it ends with breath. The third line ends with death, pans, countenance, wrist, mist, head, bed, and then the B lines are dizzy, easy, shelf itself, knuckle, buckle, dirt, shirt. So very standard, very predictable. There's not a lot of variation or slant rhyme or anything like that going on in this poem. This poem is also a memory. It is a memory of a child dancing with his father late at night before bed. One of the things I want you to notice is the language in this poem. There's lots of playful language or language that suggests a playful atmosphere. So, the idea of waltzing or dancing with a father. The word papa is a term of endearment. Words like dizzy, hanging on to his father, waltzing, romping, a hand that's holding his wrist could be interpreted as, a sign of affection or perhaps steadying or connection. And then, there's the time, beating time along with the music, waltzing off to bed. The child is clinging to his father's shirt. So there's kind of a playful tone that's set by some of the language here, and maybe even a sense of affection and closeness between the child and the parent. In addition to this playful language, though, I also want you to notice some different language. There's whiskey, which might suggest, celebrating or relaxing, but the intensity of the whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy. So this is a child smelling, I guess, his father's breath and realizing that his father has definitely been drinking, and in fact so much that it makes the child feel a little bit maybe intoxicated or disoriented. And yes, the child is holding on, but he's holding on like death, which is obviously a dark image, and the dance that they're doing is not an easy dance. You've got the image of the dancing being so boisterous that the pans are sliding off the shelf. So it's one thing to romp around the room. It's another thing to make the dishes not just rattle but fall. So obviously, this is a pretty rowdy thing that's happening, maybe even out of control, which is suggested by the image of the mother's face, which could not unfrown itself. That's an interesting play on words or use of language. It's not just that the mother is frowning, but it's also that it's impossible for her to stop frowning, which is an indication that she is not happy about what she's seeing. There is the image of the hand that's holding the child's wrist, but that does raise the question of whether the hand should be holding the child's hand. Holding a wrist sometimes can feel a little bit different than having your hand held. And then you've got this hand that's also battered, so that lets us know that the father's hand is beat up. Perhaps he's kind of a hard-working person. But the word battered also has a secondary meaning of abuse. So that word choice is significant. Then you also get the idea that the child is much smaller, obviously, than his father, so that his head or his ear is about the height of the buckle on his father's belt. That's one thing, but the fact that his ear keeps scraping the buckle suggests that perhaps the father is being a little careless in his intoxicated state, or maybe even cruel. And then, of course, there's not just the father keeping time, but the word beat kind of echoes the same connotation as the word battered from earlier. And this is happening on his head. So, again, that could be playful, but that could also be painful. Why Roethke didn't use the word tapped instead of beat kind of raises the question of whether he's wanting the reader to sense that there's something a little bit more foreboding or ominous going on here is important. Because he could have said, "You tapped time on my head," and he would have kept the same meter going, and the tapping would have a different kind of connotation than the word beat. The palm caked hard by dirt also reinforces the idea of the father having been working really hard and not cleaning up before this, nighttime frolic. And then you've got the father waltzing the child off to bed. But the fact that the child is clinging to the father's shirt kind of has that dual possibility. Either it's a sign of affection, or it may be because the child is being kind of slung around and is having to hold on for dear life. So when you pay close attention to the language and the imagery in this poem, you see this mix of playful language or language that suggests a playful environment or a playful interaction, and then language that suggests something more ominous, something perhaps even more frightening or abusive. And this raises the point about the narrator of this poem, which is that this narrator is remembering a childhood memory, but the narrator is an adult. That's an important point because the narrator is reflecting back on something that happened presumably a number of years ago. And so that juxtaposition that you have between the playful language and the more ominous language kind of raises the question of how accurate the adult's memory is. Is the adult narrator remembering something that was actually very, very painful and very frightening and trying to put a more positive spin on it? Is it not possible for him to remember what happened? Or was it actually a positive interaction and the adult has some resentment towards his father that might color his view? So we get all these details. There's the memory of the pans falling from the shelf and the mother's face. That's a really vivid, I think, description, and a poignant description. But because of this mix of the playful, the language suggesting, a more fun situation versus a more frightening situation, that just raises the question of how accurate the adult narrator's memory is. So we don't know what the truth is about this scene, and we don't know whether the narrator actually knows or can even tell us what the truth is about that interaction.